A resident at an apartment complex gets a notice on his door, so he decides to confront the leasing office. But during that confrontation, bullets fly out, killing the apartment complex's beloved property manager. Thanks for joining us on Law&Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. Police say that angry resident stormed into the leasing office and asked, "Are you really kicking me and my pregnant girlfriend out onto the streets?" Then he pulled out a gun. So the leasing manager stepped in, but was killed during the confrontation. Now the killer is learning his fate in court. This is Josiah Goecker. He was a husband, father, and he was the property manager of the Alpine Apartments in Anchorage, Alaska. On October 23rd of 2023, the 34-year-old was in the leasing office when one of the residents, Jesse Jones, stormed in. Earlier that day, Josiah posted a notice that the complex wasn't renewing the lease of Jesse's apartment. So Jesse, reportedly with the eviction notice in his hand, went to the leasing office and asked that question I mentioned just a bit ago. "Are you really kicking me and my pregnant girlfriend out onto the streets?" Then he pulled out a handgun and tried to fire it, but the gun malfunctioned. When that happened, it seemed like Josiah took that moment to try to get the gun out of his hands. Then the two struggled over the weapon. According to the Alaska Department of Law, Josiah ended up putting his hands up, and Jesse took that moment to fire the gun. But not just once, reportedly at least 7 times. The shooting was right in front of Josiah's coworker, too.
My fear was that he's going to notice I'm still here in the office and that he was going to come for me.
We learned that it was Josiah's coworker, Rosemary Ortiz, who was the one who witnessed the shooting, and she called 911. But by the time police arrived, Josiah was already dead. Police called Jesse's girlfriend, the pregnant one, and she had no idea their apartment was served a notice. She also told them her boyfriend's mother gave him the handgun, and it was normally kept in a shoebox in their apartment. So when police searched that shoebox, you might have already guessed it, but that gun was missing. Jesse wasn't arrested until 3 days later. While on the run, he got rid of the gun, and according to the Alaska Department of Law, he spent a chunk of that time on the run on a meth binge. So that was 2023. In February of this year, Jesse Jones went on trial. Prosecutors argued Jesse had a plan to kill Josiah from the moment he walked into the door.
And specifically tells Detective Clark, "I went in with ill will and ill intentions to kill whoever gave me that notice."
And while the defense never denied Jesse shot and killed Josiah, the defense claimed he didn't have any intent to kill, even though he went to the leasing office with a gun. But the defense claims Jesse just went over there for an explanation about the notice. The defense claimed Jesse was desperate because he was at the risk of losing his apartment, he didn't have a job, and his girlfriend had a baby on the way. The defense chalked up the shooting to a heat of passion, even claiming Jesse was in fear of his life because at one point, both he and Josiah struggled over the gun.
Went downstairs. It wasn't a good idea that he took his gun, but if he was intending to kill, he would have just gone there and started shooting. But he wanted to speak with the person who was responsible for putting that notice on his door, and that's what he did.
Did the jury buy that defense? Not at all, because after an hour of deliberations, they came back with their verdict: guilty. Guilty on first-degree murder, guilty on assault in the third degree for threatening Rosemary Ortiz, and guilty on tampering with physical evidence. Josiah's wife posted this message after the verdict: "The defendant was found guilty on all 5 charges. Praise Jesus. We want to thank the jury, the district attorney, the police officers, troopers, detectives, etc. that were involved. They all did an incredible job. Nothing will bring my husband back, but justice was served, and we are so thankful. Thank you to the thousands of people praying over us. We are so thankful." So next was sentencing. The defense recommended to the judge anywhere between 30 to 40 years in prison. According to the Anchorage Daily News, in a court filing, Jesse's attorney argued that he didn't have the tools, knowledge, or experience to cope with highly stressful situations like facing the loss of housing, and claimed that there was a chance that he could become a productive citizen with the right treatment. Whereas the prosecution recommended 80 years, 78 years for first-degree murder, and 2 consecutive years for third-degree assault. Prosecutors argued Jesse shot Josiah for no reason other than his own misplaced anger and complete inability to control his emotions. The judge's decision was ultimately a little less than the prosecution's recommendation: 75 years for first-degree murder, 2 consecutive years for third-degree assault, for a total of 77 years. I have with me here former prosecutor and Law&Crime legal analyst Dan Shore. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. I got to ask right off the bat, 77 years is a long time in prison and likely means no chance of getting out of prison too. But what's your reaction to the sentence that came down this week?
Right. Well, I think the sentence surely is a life sentence. He's 28. So even at that young age, you're talking, if he served 77 years, that's 105 by the time he would be released. Maybe he could be eligible earlier, but I think that has to do with the nature of the crime and also the strength of the case from the prosecution, that there's no doubt that this defendant was the one who shot and killed the victim. He admitted it. There seems to be no mitigating factor in terms of, sometimes it's maybe it doesn't qualify as self-defense, but maybe there's some mitigation that the person who was shot had somehow started the altercation. None of that is present here. So the absence of mitigating factors and the strength of the case and the severity of it, that he killed a relatively young person who had a family without any justification, I think that merits this long sentence.
Yeah, and it makes complete sense too. And it just seems so heinous too to think about. You got a notice at your door, then you just come down to the office, the leasing office, with a gun, and then you just kill the property manager just because you're upset. But I want to go back to a point that you had mentioned in your last answer about the whole self-defense thing. I think initially the defense was kind of saying that, oh, during that moment where Josiah was struggling for the gun from Jesse, that Jesse thought, oh, maybe he might be shot, and was claiming that that might have played into self-defense. What are your thoughts on that kind of defense?
Right. Well, they raise that, and certainly, if you're a defense attorney or a defendant, you have to raise something. You don't generally, they don't just say, as a defendant, I prosecuted murder cases in New York City. Defendants generally don't just admit everything without giving some version that makes it seem a little more okay for them to do what they did. Even when people admit to crimes such as homicide, they often tailor their narrative to be a little more kind. Ultimately, there wasn't anything that defense could really push for because the defendant came to the office with a gun. There was no reason why the victim was a threat, and someone else defending themselves from being shot and killed, which is what happened here, doesn't lead to a justification defense if then the initial person shoots and kills someone. And that's a principle in law beyond this case, that if someone initiates a physical conflict, they give up their right to use self-defense if then if the other person escalates the conflict, because we don't want people punching someone and then when the other person attacks them back, then they can shoot that person. So the law does not allow that on purpose.
And the judge noted during Jesse Jones's sentencing that he had numerous opportunities to change the course of what happened that day, which is completely true. He could have not gone over to the leasing office with the gun. He could have not did half of the things that he did that day. But even during the interaction right before the shooting, that Josiah was showing him compassion, and he even put his hands up during the struggle. What are your thoughts overall on just how this could have been completely preventable?
Right. And that goes into the sentencing issue we talked about before, that there really are no mitigating factors here, that the defendant went with a gun to confront someone over a property issue because his lease wasn't being renewed or he wasn't going to be able to live where he was anymore, that the victim was not a threat to him, had not started any conflict with him. And right, he could have not gone there. He could have gone there without a weapon. Once he went there with a weapon, he could have decided not to use that weapon. Once he brandished the weapon and he didn't immediately shoot the victim, he could have decided, I'm going to stop. So there were a lot of decision points that unfortunately and tragically, he did not choose the right way to proceed. And that's why you have the conviction. That's why you have this really steep sentence. You have a 34-year-old father who is working in this office, doing his job, didn't do anything wrong, and he was shot and killed by this defendant.
Yeah, and it's just horrible. And are you surprised, Dan, that this case even went to trial as opposed to possibly the defendant taking a plea instead?
A little bit, because usually when the strength of the case is very strong, people will have an incentive to plea. But sometimes what happens in these cases, and I've been on the side as a prosecutor, sometimes when the case is so strong, the prosecution doesn't offer a plea bargain that is something that the defendant would want to take. So if the government feels, well, we have the strong case, there aren't mitigating factors, we feel confident in getting conviction, they don't really have a lot of reason to offer a plea bargain to let the person out earlier, especially if the family of the victim doesn't want that. So often that's why these cases go to trial, because if the plea bargain is to spend almost your whole life in prison, even if it's a strong case, as a defendant, you might want to just take your chances at trial anyway, because it's probably not worse than a plea bargain that is going to put you in prison for decades or your whole life.
And does 77 years for a defendant, does that sound any better than life in prison? Because to me, they're both one and the same.
No, it's the same thing unless there's some way he could get out early. He's 28 years old. if he lived to 105, he would be getting out then if he served the full sentence. But 77 years is a long time in terms of public policy and criminal justice reform. And we've seen different movements across the decades about when people should be released, how they should be released. So who knows what's going to happen between now and the next few decades. So if that's probably what he has to hold out for, that somehow the sentence changes, or there's some change in the law that can get him an earlier release.
Yeah, and we doubt the possibilities of that happen. But to your point, 7 decades is a long amount of time. A lot of things can change, but it's looking likely that the rest of his life in prison will be just that. But do you think the sentence would have played out a little differently had Jesse Jones not fled for 3 days, went on a meth binge? Maybe he would have stayed behind, called 911, called police, something to that effect. Do you think it would have played out differently, or because the act was just that heinous that, the sentence might have just been the same?
It's possible. I don't look, if it was a more minor crime, then certainly avoiding law enforcement, fleeing, those can be aggravating factors that can lead to a longer sentence. But when you're talking about an unprovoked murder with no mitigating factors of a 34-year-old person who is just doing their job, it's hard to see the other factors that you mentioned. Although they're important, they're really small compared to taking a life in cold blood, which is what he was convicted of doing here. So I don't think they made that much of a difference in sentencing, but they certainly removed potential mitigating factors. If someone surrenders right away, confesses right away, sometimes those mitigating factors can be helpful, and he did not do that.
I think another part to this story too is just that Josiah's colleague and coworker was there, witnessed the shooting, crawled, I think, under one of the office desks to hide because she was scared that her life would have been taken too, which, when an angry resident comes over with a gun, you can't help but think that way. But in terms of just what she had gone through, I just can't even imagine what it was like for her, and her having to get on the stand to just recall all of that. So as a former prosecutor, what is it like talking through a living witness, a survivor, and having them get on the stand to recall just one of the most horrible days of their lives?
It's very challenging as a prosecutor, because that is no doubt a traumatic experience to see your coworker and friend shot and killed in front of you, not knowing if you were going to survive, and then going into court recounting that, and then also facing the person who did that in person, generally for the first time. That's really difficult. And I did this not only with adults, but also child victims of sex abuse cases where they had to come into court. And I think you really want to take them through what to expect in court, so there are hopefully fewer surprises. I'd often take those witnesses to the courtroom so they see what it's like, explain where they're going to be sitting, where the defendant's going to be sitting, where the court officers are there, because that's often comforting to witnesses, to let them know that there's not an opportunity for the defendant to attack them while they're in court, because that's what people are fearing. So you want to put a lot of thought into planning that and making someone feel comfortable, but nothing's going to fully prepare someone for moment like that, recounting a tragedy that's traumatic in front of the person who did it.
And as a prosecutor, as a former prosecutor, when you're about to go to a sentencing hearing, you're about to give your recommendation to the judge about how long a defendant should serve in prison, how much does the family and the loved ones get a say in what the prosecution may relate to the judge in terms of, they believe that it should be this amount of years versus this amount of years? How much does the family get a say in that, if any?
In my experience, they get a strong say. It's not persuasive. It doesn't always carry the day. But certainly, if there's a family that's saying, we want the maximum sentence here, we don't want this person to ever be out again because they took our loved one's life, which is a very understandable position, that's going to mean something to a prosecutor and also to a judge, versus a family that might say, we are horrified by this tragedy, we want him in prison, but we do think that, let's say, hypothetically, 30 years would be sufficient or something like that. So as a prosecutor, I always talk to the family. The families often can make impact statements that go to the judge, and those are considered. But ultimately, it's not just about the family and the victim. It's about society at large and protecting them from someone who might be a safety threat when they come out of prison.
And, I'm glad that the family was able to get justice out of this case. And I believe, according to reports, that they're satisfied with this sentence. But of course, I'm sure they would have loved Josiah back instead, as opposed to having to go through all of this. And it's just horrible. I can't even imagine. Dan Shore, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this case. Before we sign you off, though, I hear you have some exciting news. Anything you want to share with us?
Sure. Well, my second novel is coming out August 12th. It's called Open Bar, and it's based on sexual misconduct investigations that I've done as a prosecutor and an investigator. So people can go online to pre-order, or they could go to Substack and find me, where I write about these issues on a regular basis.
Alrighty, well, Dan Shore, everyone check it out. Dan Shore, again, thank you so much for your time and your insight. I'm looking forward to that book coming out too.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's always good to talk with you.
Josiah's brother Jared told Anchorage Daily News that the family is satisfied with Jesse Jones's sentence and are thankful that he won't be able to walk the streets again as a free man. Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner.